Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the IA School of Thought series with me, Syed Kamall. I'm the Acting Academic and Research Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I'm also a Professor of Politics and International Relations at St Mary's University in Twickenham. Now, this series is based on the IA book School of Thought, 101 Great Liberal Thinkers by Eamonn Butler, which, as the title suggests, summarises the thoughts of leading classical liberal thinkers on a range of issues and discusses them within a modern context. All the episodes in this series can be found on our IA YouTube channel, IA London, and on the IA podcast, which is available on Podbean, Apple and Spotify, as well as on our website, ia.org.uk. Now, today we'll be discussing the influential economists Gordon Tullock and James Buchanan, both known as the fathers of public choice theory. And to discuss these great men, their ideas and contribution to classical liberal thought, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Bjørnskov, Professor of Economics and at the Department of Economics at Aahrus, I'm sure I've mispronounced that, Aahrus University in Denmark, but he's also a trustee of the IEA and a member of the IEA's Academic Advisory Council. Christian, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Well, why don't I start off by asking, why did you choose Gordon Tullock specifically? And what is it about his work that inspired you?
Well, he's one of my heroes. He's probably the economist that has inspired me the most and shaped how I think about political economy and economic policy. But he's also interesting because he's probably one of the most creative economists ever, at least in the 20th century. He contributed to so many different fields within the social sciences that it's difficult to pinpoint him.
And when you say the different fields, just give us a taste of what the different fields that he did get involved in, as it were.
Well, he's one of the major influences on public choice, political economy, whatever you want to call it. He wrote the book of public choice with James Buchanan in 1962. That's the one called The Calculus of Consent. But he's also been influential in the way we think about autocracies. And there's even a small, really nice article from the early 70s about the economic behavior of the coal tit, that is a small bird.
So there we are, just quite a range in many ways. Now, of course, as we all know, both Tullock and John Buchanan are known as the founders of the public choice theory school. Can you explain to our audience in a nutshell what public choice theory is and how these two men contributed to the field?
Yeah, public choice theory is sometimes described as the use of methods that are common in economics to questions that are common to political science. So it's essentially the idea that if you want to think about anything in political science or economics, you need to make the same assumptions about behavior no matter where people act. So essentially, public choice says that, well, economists think that everyone does the best for themselves. Doesn't mean that they're egotistical or whatever. They just follow their own goals. And they do that if they run a business or they shop for groceries or whatever they do. Now, let's assume that politicians do exactly the same thing. So it's essentially the idea that we don't assume that people are schizophrenic, that they change personality if they move into politics or if they move into the bureaucracy. Everyone behaves fundamentally the same everywhere. And that's public choice. And that opens up a number of new insights. For example, if you go back before 1960, most people assume that politicians always do the right thing. Bureaucrats always automatically do the right thing. If you make that assumption, it's impossible to understand why you have corruption. If you make the public choice assumption that people basically do what's best for themselves, corruption is really not a surprise. So that's what public choice is. Buchanan once said that public choice is essentially politics without romance.
And that's interesting because, as you say, people quite often assume, they talk about, say, market failure and look for government to solve the problem, but then assume that whoever the person in government is neutral, or the bureaucrats are neutral and working in some sort of detached, neutral public interest. And public choice theory suggests that this is not the case. Is that right?
That's right. In the 20s and 30s, there's a lot of interest in market failures, why markets perhaps pollute too much and educate too little. Public choice opens up an analysis of government failure. So it actually asks the question, okay, if we have a market failure, we should only do something if we don't create a much larger government failure. So in that way, it's inherently critical of state action, because any public choice theorist will tell you that, well, there's always a risk of making things even worse because of government failures, and government failures are endemic.
So, I mean, I think it's almost self-evident, but tell us, why is public choice theory important to liberal thought?
Well, it's important because before public choice theory, we had liberal thought on what the state ought to do, what it ought to do and ought not to do. But public choice theory actually gives us much more ammunition. Even if we think that the state ought to do this, public choice theory forces us to ask, would an actual state, actual bureaucrats, actual politicians actually do this if we asked them to do it? Or would they do something else that might be much worse?
Now, when we look at public choice theory, of course, we think of Tullock and Buchanan. But did they agree on everything, or were there issues that they actually disagreed on?
They absolutely didn't agree on everything. And their working relation was tense, so to speak. The interesting thing is that Tullock was a cynic, really. Buchanan was always an idealist. So if you read the Council of Consent, so the 1962 book, the parts on constitutional economics are mainly Buchanan's, saying that, well, if we think that there are these problems, what kind of constitution would we want to design that would keep our politicians to mostly doing the right thing? The tension here comes from the fact that Buchanan thinks of these optimal constitutions and how we should define rules that keep politicians in check. Tullock would always ask Buchanan, why would we assume that politicians respect those rules? So the great thing about their cooperation was that Buchanan was very careful in thinking about these rules. Tullock pushed him towards thinking the argument to its logical conclusion, including, well, if we set up these rules, would anyone follow the rules? And that's why you get this tense cooperation between the two. And after the mid-1960s, they do very little together.
That's interesting, because one of the things you can see that the great work that came out of their work, some people might argue that's an example of sort of creative tension, if you like, in a way. Let's focus then on Tullock, because I know you're particularly influenced by him. What is it? Who specifically influenced Tullock and his ideas? You said he was more cynical, as it were. What was he, or who was he influenced by?
It's difficult to say who was influenced. Who influenced Tullock, because his personal history is weird. He grew up in Rockford, Illinois. He joined the army at the outbreak of the World War II, and went to the University of Chicago and obtained a JD. So he was trained as a lawyer. He wasn't trained as an economist. In his entire life, he only took one economics course. So this basic insights in price theory that he got at Chicago was essentially the only economic influence on him. But in 1947, he went to work for the Foreign Service and spent quite a lot of time in Asia. He was posted in both Hong Kong and Korea. And that experience really influenced him. Seeing how different societies work and seeing the bureaucracy work from the inside was very, very influential, and shaped his thought on how both politics and everything else works.
Now, Tullock, as well as being known for public choice, also known for a number of other things. One of the things is rent seeking. Can you explain to us what that is and why this idea is important today?
Well, Tullock published a 1967 article, which in itself is interesting because it was rejected by a couple of very, very prestigious journals. One of them said that this is just trivial. We'll know this already. The other one said, this is obviously nonsense. That's not how people behave. So it was published in a minor journal. But he defined rent-seeking as the use of scarce resources in order to obtain a pure redistribution. And one of Tullock's great examples in the 1967 article is trade policy. So you have a number of firms that would be interested in being protected against international competition. If you get protection, so if you get trade barriers, they're going to make large profits. Tullock asked, so why wouldn't they invest resources in trying to get trade policy that benefits them? That activity is rent-seeking, that you use resources to get something that is a pure rent that someone else pays. And that became sort of the go-to explanation of why we have these trade barriers and why they're so difficult to get rid of.
It's interesting you say that. I remember when I was a politician, sometimes people would come and see me and they were asking for a particular law. And I realized there and then that it was a law that I knew would benefit their company. And I actually once said to someone, you've come here asking for this particular piece of legislation. You're a rent seeker, aren't you? And he said, I suppose I am. So I thought, very interesting. Even they recognized it. How influential do you think Tullock has been in shaping classical liberal thought overall?
I think over the years he's been very, very influential because his ideas of rent seeking have been, they are now sort of a standard way of explaining things in economics and political science. So many people would not know that Tullock was influential on their way of thinking about classical liberal thought or whatever, because he's become standard. It almost seems like common sense, but I think he's been so influential that no one thinks about him as the source of those kinds of thoughts.
Do you think Tullock would have seen himself as a classical liberal in that case? Or do you think he's one of those people where lots of different schools can lay a bit of a claim, a bit like the work of Elinor Ostrom, for example, where people from different philosophical traditions may lay claim to that work?
I don't think Tullock saw himself as belonging to any school or any line of thought. He saw himself as someone who reached the right analysis of whatever he looked at. And his conclusions were almost always perfectly consistent with classical liberalism. But he wasn't concerned about ideology, which is probably also why he quite often insulted people.
And you touched a bit upon a bit of his background. Do you want to tell us a bit more about him as a person, his background, his life?
Well, he was born in 1922 in Rockford, Illinois, to a completely normal family. We don't really know much of his upbringing. It seems to have been very, very normal. Went to the University of Chicago, enrolled in the Army, went back to University of Chicago, worked for the Foreign Service for 9 years, and then he went back to academia and ended up teaching international relations at the University of South Carolina. And that's where he then came into contact with James Buchanan, who was in Virginia at that time. But it's quite weird. In the mid-1950s, he does a bit of work on inflation and inflationary policies based on his experiences in Asia. And then by 1959, suddenly he publishes this paper called Problems of Majority Voting, that is iconoclastic almost. Where he outlines that, well, normal majority voting in democracy is probably a really bad way of doing things. So that's where the first time you really see the Tullock that everyone gets to know afterwards. This guy who is really provocative, but in a way that you can't just say, well, he's wrong. Yeah. Because as one of the members of the Nobel Prize Committee is allegedly said that Tullock's contributions were just controversial for the Nobel Prize. He didn't get it. Buchanan got it. And the problem was that they are just too controversial for the Nobel Prize, in particular because he's always right. His personal life is just shaped by academia. We don't really know. He never married. He didn't get any children. He was a professor, and in many ways, as Buchanan said, he was a natural economist. This was just the way he thought about everything, including his own life.
What's interesting, you say, is, as you say, is that he's actually quite multidisciplinary. It's interesting that, I mean, I teach IR theory in university, and one of the theories we look at is the idea of principal agent theory, which I know, is obviously in politics and economics as well. And when countries delegate certain functions to an international organization, and that international organization, you assume the bureaucrats are acting in the international interest, but of course they'll be acting in their own interest. So once again, it's almost full circle, given that Tullock himself also taught international relations. Looking at classical liberals today, so many classical liberals read research from Tullock. The IA itself has published a primer on public joy theory based on Buchanan and Tullock's work. What do you think is the biggest lesson that classical liberals today can learn from Tullock's ideas?
I think Tullock would probably say that the biggest lesson is to never trust anyone to automatically do the right thing. To always look at people's incentives. So for example, you might have the perfectly benevolent politician who would want to do the right thing at every point in time. But she will have to attract voters. She has to somehow make herself reasonably popular within her own party. She has to somehow attract special interest to get support. So Tullock would say, well, given those incentives there, even the perfectly benevolent politician is going to do the wrong thing to either attract votes or attract support. So I would guess Tullock would say, as he did several times during conference where I met him, that you have to look at people's incentives. You can't just assume that someone's going to do the right thing.
Now, did he make an impact immediately? I mean, or did it take time for his ideas to sort of percolate and become seen as standard?
Well, he didn't make an impact. So his 1959 paper about majority voting was seen as a very, very interesting but minor concern. The 1962 book with Buchanan really started off interest there. And his own 1965 book, which called The Politics of Bureaucracy, became very important. But it took some time with all of his contributions here. The great example is the 1967 article where he actually defines rent-seeking. The word rent-seeking is not Tullock's, that's Anne Kruger's. Kruger published a paper in 1974, which is basically about Turkish trade policy and why it looks so weird, where she defines rent-seeking. And after that paper was published, someone approached Kruger and said, well, isn't this just what Gordon wrote in 1967? She hadn't read Tullock's paper. Very few people had. But Kruger did write it and afterward admitted that, well, yeah, this is what Gordon wrote. But it's typical that his research becomes influential, but it takes quite some time before people warm to the thought of it.
Now, this is a question I ask everyone about their chosen thinker, and it's what would they, Tullock in this case, wish that we better understood now, today?
Well, I think it's difficult because he did so many different things. So he would say a lot of different things we should understand. One of the things that I know he was annoyed with, that we don't really understand, is monarchy. So why are monarchies so successful? Tullock wrote a little bit about that. I was fortunate enough that some years ago, he actually commented on the paper I wrote about monarchy with a colleague in Copenhagen. But I know from that conversation that he was just annoyed that no one was interested in actually analyzing monarchy and those kinds of odd political arrangements, which is really important to both Denmark, where I live, or the UK. That both are constitutional monarchies, both do really, really well in the long term. And is that because of the monarchy? Well, Tullock thought so, actually. I also think that he would be quite annoyed with the way people, most people today, speak about autocracies. Again, he made some of the first really important explorations of the economics of autocracy. But if you talk to hedge fund managers or investors and so on, they have no idea of how to analytically think about policy making and autocracies, even though it's highly important to their investments.
For the benefit of listeners and viewers, do you want to define an autocracy? An
autocracy is a country where, or it might have elections, but the elections don't change anything. So Russia is an autocracy. China is also an autocracy, but where you don't have real elections. You can find a number of different countries. Venezuela also has elections, but they never change anything.
Sure, that's very helpful. Look, so just to sum up now, what is, I suppose I call this either the elevator pitch or the sort of one or two sentence summary. What is it about Tullock? Why would you urge people watching this podcast or listening to it to go out and grab something to read by Tullock?
I think the great thing about Tullock is that he couldn't care less about what you think right now. He will always provoke you. He will always make you think about things, and he will very, very often, in the end, force you to reconsider what you think is an assumption that you always took for granted. He's going to challenge your basic assumptions about how politics work, how international relations work, how economies work, and so on.
Well, Dr. Christian Bjørnskov, thank you very much for talking about Gordon Tullock, one of the fathers of public choice theory, along with James Buchanan. Can I also thank our viewers and listeners for joining us today? I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. We are producing a wide range of original content every week, so please subscribe to the IEA YouTube channel, IEA London, and listen to our IEA podcasts on Podbean, Spotify, and Apple. And to help us keep providing free content during these tough times, if you know of someone who might consider throwing a few pennies our way, no matter how modest, please point them to iea.org.uk/donate-now, where they can donate online. Once again, Dr. Christian Bjørnskov, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to our viewers and listeners, and we hope that you'll join us again soon. Thank you.